of God, Creator, Redeemer, Sustainer. Amen.
Amen.
Well, it's been a month since I preached, and it seems like the world has yet again shifted in that last month. There's been a number of significant events globally, and of course a number of significant deaths. The assassination of Charlie Kirk took place, itself shocking, as was the subsequent crackdown on media, Democrats' free speech, and other aspects of what we take for granted in a modern democratic society. There is, of course, as we've mentioned, after the Patronal Festival last Sunday, the passing of Viestel's Seelens due to illness, multiple myeloma, and then the Saturday before that, the passing of Li Xiaoying due to a tragic car accident. A local Chinese lady about whom we knew almost nothing until yesterday, when we learned her name, that she raised 9 daughters, 11 grandchildren, lived in Toorak Gardens for 18 years on the corner of Grant and Port Road, up that way, and that she loved tofu, fish, and brightly coloured clothes. To this list of unexpected loss of life in the last month, some might also add the Adelaide Crows, who had 2 devastating losses after such a promising year, and many people are also in grief for that. We won't mention those who support Geelong, though, who are particularly happy at the moment, or those who don't support Collingwood, who are even happier. Human life is funny, isn't it? And why is it that lives speak to us often in a way without words? In fact, that's what the psalm says in talking about the heavens, which is not talking about heaven, but about the world that we know it. One day tells it to another, night to night communicates knowledge, yet there is no speech or language, nor are their voices heard. We never heard anything from Li Xiaoying, and yet her life spoke to all of us, and so many were deeply saddened by her tragic loss. None of us have known, I don't think, Charlie Kirk, and yet the information about his life and passing, but also many of the things he said, have also affected us in some cases deeply. What is it about the human life that causes us to, other lives to speak to us, lives that we might think we would wish to emulate? And a lot of this gets down to what scientists have discovered in recent decades is to do with the phenomenal ability of humans and also primates to mimic others. First noticed in the lab, in fact, with primates, when they were studying they were studying primates, and they noticed that one of the lab assistants, this was decades ago, was scratching their elbow, and they noticed the monkey scratched its elbow. So the lab assistant scratched his head, and the monkey scratched their head, and this led to a whole lot of further investigations and the discovery of mirror neurons in the mind, which basically fire up when we see somebody else doing something. We all experience this. Have you ever been speaking with someone with a particular accent, and then after a while you find yourself imitating it unintentionally? Or you know how couples sometimes, after many years together, they start to look like one another or behave like one another. Their language starts to become similar. This is yet another example of this mirror neurons and the fact that it's actually critically important. That's how we learn things. But it's been discovered and shown to occur at a much bigger level than this in modern psychology, that basically emotions are contagious. Again, we all know this. If you're in the presence with somebody who's anxious, we know, scientists know, but we often experience this ourselves, our anxiety tends to get triggered. If we know that if somebody is very angry, that it tends to make other people around them very angry. And René Girard, in fact, took this and developed this whole idea of imitation and what he called mimetic rivalry, and developed a whole theory of religion and culture around it, whereby, because he showed through many studies that violence is also contagious, and that violence begets violence, and that communities that get into these crises of mimetic violence, where he says where an act of violence is committed and then it's dealt with by another one, an eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, and then it builds up and up and up because of this imitation. And in fact, that's what I think we're seeing with the Charlie Kirk assassination, is that all the rage and the anger that has come from the other side of the ideological spectrum that supports him and his ideas has been generating more and more rage and anger and calls for revenge. And it's been used as a pretext to do more things along those lines, more things that are divisive and exclusionary, which are in accord with the sort of messages he preached. And regardless of the tragedy of his passing and the means of his passing, it should not ever detract from us the moral clarity required to evaluate the messages he preached, because they were messages that were against women, they were against people of colour, they were against LGBTQIA plus people, and they were deeply divisive and hurtful, and including the lists of academics, for instance, he kept and posted online that were supporters of diversity, equity and inclusion, mostly black academics, many of whom ended up experiencing actual violence when they were attacked by people following that understanding of the world. So here we see that violence begetting violence. And yet we also see this wonderful example of Li Xiaoying, because the thing that struck me is that when I was rung by the advertiser Saturday last week, and I was actually contacted by News Limited during the week as well, again asking for more information. But I said I don't know anything, and I was trying to wonder, because after the advertiser rang me, I rang Ian first. I said, do you know anything? And Ian, like everybody I spoke to, was deeply saddened by the news and shocked. And then I rang Mavis, because I thought Mavis knows everybody, and she walks around every day as well. She may have spoken to her, and she had tried to, but like many, had no success. So I went across the road and spoke to Kathy in the corner, Kathy, our cellist, local cellist, and Kathy too was very teary and quite surprised, and was shocked, I should say. And Kathy said we should ask Joanne, the next door neighbour, because Joanne literally knows everybody. She's the next lady along. And Joanne burst into tears and was very upset as well, but also knew nothing about her as well. So this life which there's no words, it's like this Psalm 19, there's no speech or language, nor are their voices heard, yet their sound, her witness, something about her has gone out throughout the world. And I now know two journalists who are endeavouring to write a story about her, and about something about her life, as something about it has captivated us. Because as I was thinking about it, it's the way it was the embodiment. It was the fact that rain, hail or shine, she walked around the church and around the suburbs clearly, and we now know she suffered a horrific stroke, and she moved at an incredibly slow pace, and I often worried that she would fall over, but she was there every day and just plodded along and got there, and she embodied that perseverance, that dedication. And the word that came to me was that sort of authenticity, that she there's something about her that the way she lived spoke to us, and we wanted to imitate it, and we liked that. And so here we have the case of the good thing also just as violence begets violence and anxiety begets anxiety, goodness begets goodness, and hope begets hope. And so we should use this principle, I believe, in all of our lives, and particularly for our community, that because in the light of all the terrible news that keeps pouring in through social media and stuff, it's very easy to get despondent, isn't it? But to realise if we practice welcome and hospitality and inclusion, and others see that and experience it, it'll be contagious. It'll carry on. People will catch it. And that's a way we can counter all the negativity and stuff. Yesterday, I read a fascinating article in the Saturday paper by Stan Grant. Have any of you been following Stan Grant lately? Stan's a fascinating man, an Aboriginal thinker and journalist, and increasingly theologian. He describes himself as a theologian now, and his recent books have been extensive reflections on the nature of faith and God. And he speaks very openly now about his faith and the impact and the importance of it. And in this article in the Saturday paper a few days ago, he says it starts off he tells a story of a very prominent Australian journalist who contacted him very recently and said, "Are you like me and no longer reading the news?" And he basically said to his friend, "Yes, I've stopped reading the news as much as possible." So here you have two of Australia's leading journalists and thinkers who are intentionally stopping reading and tuning out of social media and the news, etc. And Stan goes on to explain why, the reasons why, and a big part of it is that in order to cultivate our lives, we need silence, we need space, we need able to reflect. He doesn't talk about this imitation stuff that I've talked about, but I think that's also a big part of it, is that when you read about a calamity and all the anxiety and grief of that triggers that in us, whether we're conscious of it or not. And so if we're constantly exposed to negative stories and anxiety-inducing stories and tragedy and death and division, that starts to fill our souls and our hearts. And so Stan's making a concerted effort to tune out and to dial out and to be extremely selective. And he says he asks himself a question now when he sees a headline, will I be a better person if I read this? Will my well-being be nourished if I read this story? And he says almost every time the answer is no. And it's very simple, so he doesn't have to read that much, obviously. But what a wonderful way to think about it. I encourage you to read that article if you can find it as well. And I think this is what we see with the story of Matthew in the Gospels as well, and with Jesus. And because the reason we celebrate saints, that's what we've got the red on today, because it's the Saints' Day, and we're celebrating St. Matthew, because their lives speak to us as well. And Matthew in particular, because Matthew was a tax collector, very highly disregarded and looked down upon by the people of his age, of his time. And Jesus, who in Matthew's Gospel is presented as a rabbi, as a Jewish teacher, who would have understood the distinctions between the pure and the impure, between who he supposed to have eaten with and not eaten with. Jesus ignores those distinctions and goes ahead and has a meal and sits with him. It says sits with him and has a meal with Matthew the tax collector and with sinners. And in Jesus' time, having a meal is a public event. There's no sort of privacy really in the ancient world of the sort we know about. So the whole town would have known that Jesus is sitting with a tax collector, and as a Jewish rabbi, he was not supposed to do that. And I love, and he actually answers in a very rabbi-type way, because the Pharisees who see this, interestingly, they ask the disciples, "Why does your teacher, your rabbi, eat with tax collectors and sinners?" And before they have a chance to answer, Jesus obviously, it says he heard this, he said, "Those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick do. Go and learn what this means." And then he quotes Hosea, "I desire mercy, not sacrifice. I've come to call not the righteous, but sinners." Typical Jewish form of dialogue and stuff. He doesn't answer the question, which is typically Jewish. Somebody said, Judaism is a religion of questions and Christianity is a religion of answers. And unfortunately, in many cases, that's the way it is presented. I think Christianity is also a religion of questions and not answers, but you can see definitely Judaism is absolutely a religion of questions. So Jesus doesn't answer this question. In fact, he just quotes Hosea, the Old Testament prophet, "I desire mercy, not sacrifice," and has this cryptic comment about physicians and those who need them and don't. And so in a way, Jesus' words don't tell us to be inclusive or generous or welcoming, but his actions do, because he's having this meal. He's breaking all the social guidelines, and he's identifying and showing solidarity with this tax collector. And who he eats with says a lot about who he is spiritually and socially and economically and theologically. Jesus is showing that he is including everybody and welcoming everybody. So this is another form of imitation, isn't it? Where his life, and I was thinking, something about Li Xiaoying, how just her life spoke. I reckon that's what it would have been like to be with Jesus. That just something about him and the way he was with people, it would have evoked our curiosity. It would have been compelling. It would have been puzzling at times. But then the way he, when the woman who has been bleeding for 12 years touches him in the crowd, and he turns around and says, who touched me? This would have been such a remarkable thing to be part of and to witness. And again, his life would have spoken without words so often as well. Like that psalm, and as I said, like Li Zhao Ying. So lives speak to us. As I said, I think with regards to Charlie Kirk, we need to not shy away from the moral clarity needed to evaluate forthrightly the messages that he preached, which, as I said, were against people of colour, against LGBTIQA plus people, against women, and against many others. It was a message that led of division and discord that was promulgated by his followers as well. So let's also reflect briefly on the life of Theodores, another saint in our midst. I let Grant Bullen know about his passing, as I do for all parishioners who pass away who were here when Grant was here, and he responded and thanked me very warmly and said, "To be honest, Matthew, I didn't think he'd still be here." Theodores had multiple myeloma and then acute leukemia, and for 7 years, but had this incredibly positive attitude, which itself was a witness and a testimony. In fact, I was talking about him with a member of the congregation who'd only met him a couple of times, and then he said, was he even sick? He didn't even realise he was sick because he never spoke about it. And as I've got to know a little bit about Theodores' life from meeting with the family as we prepare for the memorial, discovered just really how an incredibly remarkable man he is, and internationally famous in the area of landscape gardening. He's in a book of Australian famous designers alongside Walter Burley Griffin and others. A book which he told me about actually, and he was terribly, terribly embarrassed because he didn't know Walter Burley Griffin and the others were going to be there until he went to the book launch and discovered all these other famous people there. And but his parents fled Latvia after World War II, and he was born in Sweden, and then the whole family moved here when he was a young child, and so he really understood also about immigrants and refugees, because something I've only just learnt is that he spent his life supporting refugees and immigrants in South Australia, and he was very passionate about that. He was also passionate about animal rescue and support, and in fact, in the order of service, the charity they want people to donate to, if they wish, is a sanctuary for rescued animals. He's, as I said in my Vale email, he was famous for, he designed the Garden of Discovery at the Waite Arboretum. He's been working on this large project of a Ghana garden with a Ghana elder at Government House. He told me literally an hour before he passed away that it'll take him another year to finish that. He also told me that when he gets out of hospital next week, this was last Sunday, he had a great idea for our financial sustainability project for a way to raise lots of money. But unfortunately, he passed away before that happened. It was a very special moment praying with him and with his family, and we anointed him and prayed absolution and a blessing. And he's been such a fighter and so resilient. When I left the hospital, I thought he may even pull through this. And I think some of the others did too. And he was talking with us. So I was so surprised that after I left, they put on one of his favourite pieces of music. He closed his eyes and passed away 30 minutes later. So, which was, yeah, again, I was surprised. It was very peaceful. Yeah, but again, this life that spoke and still speaks so much through what he did. And of course, his great love was gardens, and gardens themselves are things that speak to us, aren't they? The quiet garden that we have here. The gardens are places of respite, of hospitality, of welcome. They speak to us. They're important places. And like the psalm, their sound goes out throughout the world. So we have these saints among us. You're all saints as well, in all your own ways. Each of us in our own way, in our good moments, in our better moments, reveals something about who God is like. And this is what we must cling to as well in this whirlwind of negative news and troubled times that we live in, that we can be a community that embodies these values, knowing about this idea of the contagion of peace and goodness and well-being and inclusion, that every step we take in that direction will catch on some way, that will infect, in the best possible sense, somebody else and other communities with that same sense of goodness, as I said, and hospitality. That's why we celebrate the lives of saints, St. Eustace, St. Lee, St. Matthew, the one in the Gospel that is, and that they can speak to us about the goodness of God. So we remember St. Matthew and his stories of this radical, loving Jesus. We remember Eustace and his creative, generous life. And we remember Lee and her patient, resilient, dedicated life. Amen.